But in any case, at the time, they set up rehabilitation stations in Vietnam when it turned out that a very high percentage of the people were addicted to heroin. Incidentally, it started with marijuana. It's very important in terms of understanding how drug use works, that originally there was a great deal of use of marijuana in Vietnam, which at that time, this is around 67, 68, marijuana use was just becoming very popular in the United States, starting around 65. There were 4 great waves of drug use so far, really, the great waves. There are lots and lots of other use. But first was the psychedelic business with Leary. Then there was marijuana. And then from 69 to 71 was the so-called heroin epidemic. And then beginning in about 74 was the enormous increase in the use of cocaine, which had not been there before. And that in itself is a fascinating historical study to begin to understand what influences, how these drugs appear, what causes them to become popular, how it works at a particular moment in a particular cultural setting that something can become so popular that in no time millions and millions of people try it. But to get back to Vietnam, in Vietnam they really began to arrest people for using marijuana in great numbers. And actually the Army did that reluctantly. It came about because the media had focused so much attention on the fact that we were losing the war anyway and that a lot of people were stoned. It was almost as if that was the reason. In 1 month, I think it was September 1968 or 69, they busted 10,000 people. And suddenly heroin appeared out of nowhere. There had not been heroin in Vietnam before. A lot of opiate use, indigenous opium smoking, but not heroin. And it appeared everywhere all at once, in the Delta, in Saigon, in the north, in the highlands, and its use just took over and people began to use. So the Army wanted to rehabilitate people. They were terrified that, that they'd send these people back and you'd have an epidemic of heroin addiction such as the country had never seen if you unleashed these thousands and thousands and thousands of people who were caught up in heroin use. By then, I was in Vietnam for the Defense Department to sort of look at this, and I'd begun to think about the influence of the social setting. It had taken years for this to really get through to me, and I recommend they send these people home. Now, that was a recommendation. I spoke to General Creighton Abrams, who was then in charge, and he said if I did that, I wouldn't have an army. And my feeling was that anybody who would use had used by then. It was totally available. You could buy it anywhere for very little, $1 for 100 milligrams of pure heroin. It was really incredibly cheap. And and the figures up to that point were people who were sent to places like Lexington, Kentucky, the U.S. Public Health Hospital there for detoxification. 96% of them became re-addicted when they left the hospital. Now, in retrospect, we can see that that too was a social setting variable. They went back to exactly where they'd come from. They went back to the same social situations, the same peer group and what have you, and of course they went back to addiction. Vietnam was different because you were removing them from the social setting, which was the noxious agent. Now, one of the best pieces of social science research that's been done has been done by Lee Robbins at the University of Washington, St. Louis, where she studied the returned Vietnam veterans and found that indeed well over 90% never became re-addicted. Exactly the reverse of the figures from Lexington. And if we can have one real proof that the social setting was the crucial variable, it was this piece of work. Now, once we knew that, we could look back and realize that this should not have come as a surprise to us. All one had to do was to look at the history of alcohol use in this country and nationally, and really have a sense that, of course, this is true. I don't have the time to go into the history of alcohol use in great detail in this country, but it's enough to say that in pre-revolutionary America, in colonial America, they drank 3.1 times as much per capita consumption of alcohol as there is today. And there was very little drunkenness. That the anthropologists have worked out a series of strictures through which a culture is likely to be a culture that really gets into trouble with intoxicant use versus a culture that doesn't get into trouble with intoxicant use. And that is that if the culture uses the intoxicants, this is alcohol chiefly, if they use it in a cross-generational setting where there are different sexes, different levels of age in the setting, where it's associated with food, with ritual festivities, with some sort of religious observation, and that goes to drugs other than alcohol, where it's not associated with violence, where it's not associated with a sense of strength relating to consumption, where somebody is in charge who's expected to keep decorum. Now, in colonial America, they fulfilled all of those strictures. The tavern was a meeting place for the entire community. The tavern keeper was a person of high social status in the colonies, very high social status. There's lots of evidence for that, which I won't go into at the moment, but he kept order, and he had the authority to keep order. Whole families were there. People drank together, different sexes. The idea of how much you consumed had nothing to do with your having status or considered stronger or what have you. And because somebody was in charge, it was not connected with violence. Now, the Revolutionary War changed all that. English visitors to colonial America, at that time, England was having the gin revolution, where alcoholism was rampant. So that visitors from England who came to the United States remarked again and again about the safe streets of Boston, the lack of alcoholism in the United States. There's really good evidence that the difference was enormous. But the Revolutionary War really changed that. Men left home, they went to the army, they drank just men with men, the only women around being camp followers. It was not only not prohibited, the authorities, the people in charge, gave out tots of rum. Before battle, they always gave out many extra tots. I have seen the records of what they gave to the men who rowed George Washington across the Delaware, and the fact that they were able to pull an oar is remarkable, because they had taken in a lot of rum. And so it was connected to violence. I mean, all of the things that worked went the other way. And when the Revolutionary War was over, we came back to the men came back to the Industrial Revolution, where again men worked outside their home, and all the other strictures. We opened up the West, where men were lonely and drinking was connected with relaxation. Big people could drink more than little people, so the fact that, generally speaking, so the fact that it was connected with strength and machismo and all that became very real, and alcoholism simply soared. There are a few little statistics I like to give to indicate how much, at that point in the 19th century, drinking was embedded in the culture. We paid the people who built the Erie Canal $1 a day and a quart of whiskey a day, beginning with 4-ounce portions at 6 a.m. They drank all day, a quart a day. Grocery stores, I have some old prints. Grocery stores used to have an open bottle of rum, where customers could come in and ladle, including children, and ladle a little rum in while they were giving their orders. It was to that extent that alcohol was built into the culture. And there's evidence that alcoholism rose apace in this country. Now, it is interesting that at that time, when alcoholism really was very serious with changing social conditions, the temperance movement, and it was then the temperance movement, was very weak, had no political clout at all. After the Civil War, we began to get control over alcohol use in this country. Some genius invented the free lunch, and again, the intake of alcohol was connected with food. The West began to be settled, and families began to move in, and there was a change in the kind of violence and the kind of destructiveness by the latter part of the 19th century in particular. And the conditions began to change, and alcoholism began to decline. Now, what's so interesting about that in terms of our development of social policy is that the temperance movement became the prohibition movement and became very strong politically. By the time the Volstead Act was finally passed in 1918, many states had already gone dry, had outlawed alcohol, and there was a prohibitionist fervor in this country. And of course we got prohibition. And with prohibition, we got the return of the use of alcohol to those old conditions. Speakeasies didn't serve food, generally speaking. Men drank alone. They didn't go into a speakeasy to have a drink. They went in to get drunk. It wasn't worth the trouble to go to a speakeasy for one drink. There was a lot of violence connected with speakeasies. The people who were there, who had the authority, were not there to reduce drinking. They were there to keep opponents out who would interfere with the drinking. So you had all the conditions again, and after an initial drop of alcohol use in Prohibition, by the end of Prohibition,